Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are strapping in for a journey through the Arkansas piney woods.
We are.
Specifically, we're taking a really intensive look at Crossett, Arkansas. And this isn't just, a spot on a map.
Not at all.
It's a 60-year, meticulously engineered society. It's an industrial model town built really entirely by corporate decree.
And we are doing this deep dive specifically for you, our listener, who comes to this with 30 years in the staffing services industry.
Right.
And you're bringing that MS in industrial and organizational psychology to the table. And, Crossett is just the ultimate case study.
It really is. It's all about maximizing organizational efficiency through, absolute control and a kind of strategic, long-term human capital investment.
That's the perfect way to put it.
That's exactly right. For most towns, history is something that just sort of happens to them. But for Crossett, the town was, and this is a quote from our sources, spoken into existence by the fiat of corporate will.
What a phrase.
Isn't it? So our mission today is really to follow your fascination with this, to systematically unpack the massive resource expenditure, the strategic control, and just the sheer human will it took to build and sustain this industrial fiefdom, this dynamo, as you called it.
And your core observation about the scale of that commitment is the perfect lens for this. You highlighted the investment in something like the Rose Inn.
Yeah.
I mean, most lumber companies at the time, they saw buildings as, temporary assets. They were disposable.
But the Rose Inn was different. It was designed to project permanence.
It absolutely was.
And when you actually break down the resources needed for that permanence, we're talking about lumber harvested from around 50 acres of prime forest.
50 acres.
Just for that one building. A building, by the way, that was mostly for executives and visitors, not even the workers.
That's a tangible, measurable cost.
No.
And it's not just in the timber. It's in the effort, what you called the renewed passion of the men building it.
Right.
That investment wasn't just construction. It was commitment to a vision that ran completely against the prevailing economic philosophy of the time.
So the question isn't just how they cut the trees down.
Exactly. The real question is why they cared enough to build something so elegant, so enduring, in what everyone else saw as a temporary extractive industry.
Why plant those deep roots? And the answer, as you pointed out, it really lies with the architect of it all, Edgar Woodward Cap Gates.
An amazing specimen, as you put it.
And when you look at his operational mindset, that description is just. It's incredibly accurate. He was an industrialist who absolutely rejected that prevailing bonanza philosophy.
The whole cut out and get out mentality.
He wasn't just looking for a quick profit. He was building an empire, a permanent fixture. And every single decision that followed, from, the forestry to the rigid social structure, it was all engineered to ensure that one thing, long-term survival.
So to really get your head around the scale of this project, we have to start with the landscape.
Yeah.
What was it actually like back in 1899?
Yeah, and it wasn't easy terrain. Not by a long shot.
No.
We're talking about southern Ashley County, Arkansas. The pioneers called it simply the Great Wilderness.
And it's not an exaggeration.
No. I mean, you have to visualize this. A dense, unbroken canopy of virgin pine and hardwood, a forest so thick it literally blocked out the sun.
And the water. The hydrology was a nightmare. Sluggish rivers, the Wachita and the Saline, just cutting through this swampy, difficult land.
And crucially, there was almost nobody there. Human settlement was minimal.
All right, just a few subsistence farmers. And they had spent their entire lives trying to beat the forest back.
They hated the forest. They saw those 100-foot pines not as a resource, not as lumber, but as an absolute impediment.
A giant weed.
Exactly. They were useful for maybe grazing some animals or hunting, but what they really wanted was clear land for their corn and cotton.
And that agrarian indifference to the pine's industrial value, I mean, that's the crack in the door that allowed all of this to happen.
They were sitting on a gold mine and had absolutely no idea.
The bigger picture, though, the catalyst, was happening on a national scale. The northern timberlands, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, they were pretty much logged out.
Tapped out.
Completely. So the capital that had powered those operations, specifically these three families, Crossett, Watsek, and Gates, they started migrating south. They were desperately looking for the last untouched reserves.
So they land in southern Arkansas looking for a place to build this industrial leviathan. And the natural first move is to go to Hamburg, the established county seat.
Right. Cap Gates goes there in 1898. He offers them everything: industrial growth, jobs, investment.
And Hamburg's commercial elite just flat out rejected him.
Outright. And it was this really fascinating sociopolitical rejection. It was steeped in these deep-seated class and racial anxieties.
So what were they so afraid of?
Well, the sources point to two main fears. First, the Hamburg gentry, their whole world revolved around cotton production. They were terrified that this massive mill would just monopolize the local labor force. Specifically, they worried it would draw African-American laborers away from the cotton fields, which they depended on.
And the second fear.
The second was about, well, disrupting their quiet agrarian social hierarchy. They worried the mill would bring in a transient, rough-hewn, and, probably rowdy sawmill element.
They didn't want the trouble.
They didn't. They feared moral and social destabilization. They basically chose their predictable, controlled social order over industrial progress.
So they told him no, build it somewhere else.
A firm no. And that rejection, that single moment, is what defined Crossett's entire origin story. It forced Gates to embrace complete and total independence.
And his response is just, it's magnificent. It sounds like something out of a foundational myth,
It really does.
He's standing there with a Judge Lachala, about 13 miles west of Hamburg, and he reportedly just kicks a pine burr across the forest floor.
The very thing the locals thought was worthless.
Exactly, and he declares, "This will be the town," just like that.
That unilateral decree, that one sentence, was the birth declaration. Crossett didn't evolve. It was imposed.
Built entirely on private land, which they bought up with an initial capitalization of, what, $400,000 or $500,000?
Somewhere in that range, yeah. And it would be ruled by private corporate law.
And that corporate independence, that's what gave Cap Gates the absolute freedom he needed to implement his grand plan.
His organizational blueprint.
Right. It wasn't just a place to cut timber. It was designed from the ground up to be a model town, one that fostered maximum industrial efficiency, rigid morality, and maybe most importantly, intense loyalty from the workforce.
A utopian vision, absolutely.
Yeah.
But a top-down, mandated vision of organizational perfection just dropped right into the middle of the raw wilderness.
So location decided by decree. The next massive hurdle is securing the actual foundation, the resources.
And this is where Gates executes this brilliant strategic masterstroke in land acquisition.
He sets up a land office in the most unassuming place you can imagine.
Right, the back of a barber shop in Hamburg.
The very town that rejected him. And he starts buying. The first big purchase is 50,000 acres at about $7 an acre.
Which even then was an absurdly low price for virgin timber. A monumental steal.
And it all circles back to that core misunderstanding, the folklore of the damn fool Yankees.
The local farmers genuinely truly believed the massive pine trees were worthless impediments to their crops.
They literally lined up to sell their timber rights. They thought these northern industrialists were going to go broke just trying to move the useless trees.
It's a massive failure of, economic perception. They were so locked into their existing model cotton that they couldn't see the industrial value of the forest right in front of them.
And that myopia is what allowed the Crossett Lumber Company to just amass this staggering reserve of resources.
They eventually got rights to over 500,000 acres of prime timber.
500,000 acres?
And that was the single most crucial strategic decision they made. It wasn't just a big piece of land. It was a 500,000-acre buffer that basically uncoupled Crossett from the short-term boom and bust cycle of the industry.
It's the resource base that let them survive the exhaustion crises that just wiped out almost all their competitors in the 1920s.
Exactly.
So they've got the land, they've got the capital. Now they have to face the physical reality of the site, which is total and complete isolation.
Right. They have to move an entire industrial complex, hundreds of tons of iron and steel and machinery, to a spot that's miles from any railroad or any navigable water.
And this is where you see that sheer industrial, just overpowering nature itself.
Because the winter of 1898 to 1899 was marked by just relentless, unending rains.
So the primitive wagon trails they were trying to use just became impassable quagmires.
Total mud pits, the heavy boilers,
Yeah.
the massive high-speed bandsaws, the engines, they would just sink instantly. Wagons were useless.
So what did they do? It's an incredible logistical nightmare.
A brutal, physically demanding solution. The accounts say they had to literally drag that massive machinery through the clinging heavy mud on sleds.
Just with teams of oxen and raw human muscle.
That's it. And that intense physical effort, it was all driven by this organizational imperative to build the mill now. It tells you everything you need to know about that early corporate culture.
And the first settlement there reflected that struggle, didn't it?
It did. It was a raw, chaotic, but also a strangely egalitarian place called Tent City.
Right near where the central streets are today.
Yep. And everybody lived there.
Yeah.
Managers and laborers side by side in canvas tents, most of them with just dirt floors.
The descriptions of the squalor are pretty brutal. Damp bedding, food cooked on crude stoves.
And severe lice infestations. It was necessary chaos, maybe, but for a company obsessed with efficiency, it was a huge problem.
A detriment to industrial hygiene.
Exactly. And for a company committed to order, this just could not stand. The administrator, a guy named Clark Buckner, he eventually recognized that Tent City was just fostering disease and inefficiency.
So he orders this dramatic intervention.
He ordered the entire encampment systematically burned to the ground.
Wow.
Yeah. And that wasn't just cleanup. It was an organizational mandate. It forced the workers to immediately transition into the sanitary, company-built wooden housing that was just starting to become available.
It's ruthless, but you have to admit it's a highly effective piece of organizational restructuring.
Yeah.
Using fire to enforce the transition to order.
Right. And despite that initial chaos, the permanent industrial core, it started to rise really, really quickly.
The steps were very methodical.
Very. First, they built the groundhog mill between 1899 and 1901. This was just a temporary sawmill.
Its only job was to cut the lumber needed to build the actual town.
The permanent structures, the big mills themselves, everything. They made the resource build its own means of production. A pure optimization strategy.
Then came the real industrial leviathans, Mill number 1 and Mill number 2.
And these were not small-time operations. They were using high-speed bandsaws, which allowed for a level of precision and mass processing that was just unheard of in the region.
And they powered this whole complex with incredible self-sufficiency.
The power plant was, for its time, technologically advanced. It was fueled entirely by sawdust and mill waste.
Which is brilliant, this idea of using your own waste streams to generate power.
It meant they were reducing their disposal costs while simultaneously providing 24-hour electricity and running water to the whole town.
Luxuries that the surrounding rural areas wouldn't see for decades. This infrastructure, it was all part of the plan to attract and, more importantly, stabilize a high-quality labor force.
Then that commitment to permanence, it was symbolized by that iconic smokestack, the 275-foot concrete smokestack built in 1924.
It took 175 gallons of paint just to coat it. In that uniform shade we'll get to later, mauve gray.
And it served two purposes. One, it was this immense landmark, you could see it for miles. But functionally, it ensured the natural draft that was necessary for those massive boilers to run efficiently.
And finally, they built that critical connection to the outside world.
The Ashley-Drew and Northern Railway, completed around 1912, it was the town's umbilical cord.
It connected that isolated industrial core to the main rail lines in Monticello.
Which allowed their millions of board feet of product to finally reach national and international markets. The town was no longer a slave to those muddy trails. It was plugged into global commerce.
Okay, so now we move into the organizational culture. And for you, our listener with the IO background, this is where it gets really, really fascinating. This is the layer of the onion where Cap Gates establishes his rule.
And he's not a mayor. He's a patriarch, a highly engaged managerial absolutist.
He totally rejected the standard municipal structure. There was no mayor, no city council in the way we think of it.
Functionally, the company manager was the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, all rolled into one person.
His authority was absolute. But the key to his success and why it worked was that his absolutism was generally benevolent.
And this isn't just charity. You have to see this as an organizational strategy.
Right. It's to secure worker loyalty and minimize turnover in an industry that was notorious for high turnover.
He practiced this radical hands-on style of personal intervention. The stories are amazing.
He knew every employee, all of them, by name.
He would personally step in to settle domestic disputes between couples living in the company houses.
He'd lend money directly from his own pocket if a family had an emergency or a medical bill they couldn't pay.
And if you think about that from a retention standpoint, if you feel financially and domestically secure because the company patriarch personally has your back, you are far less likely to go looking for another job.
It maximizes continuity and efficiency.
It's a kind of pre-digital, holistic employee retention program. It's managing the entire ecosystem of the worker, not just the hours they spend on the clock.
And this dedication to stability required some pretty rigorous social engineering,
Right.
using infrastructure and company policy to enforce a moral code.
A moral code designed specifically to maximize industrial efficiency.
The famous story of the overnight church in 1902 is just the perfect example of this kind of preemptive labor relations.
It's a classic. So a saloon opens up just outside the corporate limits. And for the company, this is an existential threat.
Right. Drunkenness means variance in performance. It means higher accident rates. It's a direct threat to the bottom line.
So Gates doesn't just lobby or complain. He finds a specific state law that forbids selling liquor within 3 miles of a church.
And his solution was surgical and immediate.
He mobilized his entire workforce, and they built a fully completed Methodist church floor, walls, roof, steeple, the whole thing overnight.
Literally overnight.
The finished, legally defensible structure was presented to the judge the very next morning.
And that legally forced the saloon to close its doors.
And Crossett remained a dry town by architectural mandate. I mean, that is a testament to unilateral decision-making aimed at protecting productivity through behavioral control.
And the enforcement of this code was relentless. The town marshal was a company employee.
His job was to police moral vice,
Mhm.
gambling, prostitution, excessive drinking. If you were undesirable, you were simply escorted to the train station and told not to come back.
And this brings us to these legendary figures like the logging boss, a man called Bully Neal.
Neal was notorious for his, let's say, physical enforcement of work discipline.
In an era before modern HR, if a laborer was hungover or just slow to get to his shift on Monday morning.
Neal would literally go to their house, drag them out of bed, and haul them to the mill floor himself.
Now, for you, a modern IO specialist, that kind of physical coercion sounds like an absolute HR disaster, a liability nightmare.
Oh, absolutely. But you have to ask, what did it achieve in the context of labor control in the early 1900s?
It achieved zero tolerance for variance.
Exactly. Downtime due to vice or absenteeism was just unacceptable in that kind of high-efficiency production model. Neal ensured the daily production metric was met, period. It was brute force operational management applied directly to the human element.
And the aesthetics of control were just as crucial to this IO model as the physical enforcement.
Which brings us to Crossett Gray.
Every single company-owned structure, we're talking houses, fences, outbuildings, everything, was painted a uniform, subdued gray color.
The official justification for management was cost efficiency. You know, buying paint in bulk saves money.
But the psychological effect was the real purpose, wasn't it?
Without a doubt. The sources are clear on this. That uniform color served as a constant, pervasive, visual reminder of the company's omnipresence. You lived, worked, and slept inside the corporate identity.
And the economics of it reinforced that psychology.
Completely. Residents paid rent, but they owned nothing. The company maintained all the property. If your roof leaked, the company fixed it.
This system fostered a pervasive psychology of dependency. It was stable, sure, but it also ensured that the workers' loyalty was tied not just to the paycheck, but to their entire environment.
It reinforced the organization's control over every single facet of their life.
And this brings us right back to that investment hierarchy you're so curious about, the rows in. The accommodations in town were clearly stratified. They communicated status.
On the lower end, you had the utilitarian beanery at 101 Pine Street.
A functional, rough boarding house for the single male laborers.
Right. Simple meals, they slept in shifts. The entire goal was maximum resource renewal for the next 11-hour workday. Get them fed, get them rested, get them back to the mill.
But the Rose Inn was a whole different ballgame. It was the architectural jewel of the town. It was an explicit statement piece for the Crossett family.
Reserved for visiting dignitaries, major investors, and, interestingly, unmarried schoolteachers. The educated, respectable class.
It had white linen dining, rocking chair verandas, strict dress codes.
So those 50 acres of timber used to build it weren't just wood, they were marketing capital. Why would a lumber company designed to strip the land build a luxury hotel?
To project stability and civility.
That's it. The Rose Inn visually and physically separated the management and their important guests from the grime and the noise of the mill.
It cemented the class hierarchy.
And it reassured outside capital that their money wasn't invested in some grubby, temporary sawmill camp. It was in a sophisticated, permanent, highly organized industrial society. The investment was proof of their long-term vision.
And that organizational stability, the whole rhythm of the town, was physically regulated by a sound.
The mill whistle.
The whistle was everything. It was the town clock, the curfew, and the alarm clock all in one.
It enforced synchronization across the entire community. It minimized any variance in labor start times. That sound regulated every single moment of the day.
5 a.m., the wake-up blast. 7 a.m., start of the shift. 6:00 p.m., dismissal.
And the final blast at night signaled the dimming of the electric lights.
That is the ultimate auditory organizational control mechanism. The entire social fabric of the town was forced to sleep and wake in perfect unison to the sound of a steam siren.
It was impossible to exist outside that corporate rhythm.
And that rhythm was sustained by corporate welfare, which, again, we have to analyze as industrial strategy, not charity.
Gates understood it perfectly. A healthy, educated workforce is a productive workforce. It minimizes production losses.
They established the Crossett Hospital very early on, and the system they used, decades before modern insurance became common, was prepaid medicine.
A small, mandatory deduction from every worker's paycheck covered medical care for the entire family.
Dr. C.E. Spivey led that effort. They offered comprehensive family care, everything from minor illnesses to maternity services.
It ensured that sickness didn't become a crippling financial or professional liability for the worker, which, again, directly stabilized the labor force. A sick worker is an expensive liability.
And one of their biggest public health victories was malaria eradication.
A huge deal. The region was prone to it, but the company partnered with the Rockefeller Foundation.
And they executed this massive public works program, draining swamps, screening houses to keep mosquitoes out, spraying oil on standing water.
This commitment virtually eliminated malaria within the town limits, and that drastically stabilized the workforce and prevented the production losses that plagued every other settlement in that swampy region.
Health equals continuity.
And continuity equals profitability. The investment in education followed the exact same logic.
They heavily subsidized teacher salaries for the Green School, which was named for the green schoolhouses they built.
And this allowed them to attract a caliber of educator that was just far, far beyond the standards of rural Arkansas at the time.
The curriculum was famously advanced. The sources say that Crossett graduates routinely entered the University of Arkansas as sophomores.
And you have to ask, why? Because the company needed skilled labor. They needed educated supervisors and managers who could handle increasingly complex industrial processes.
So investing in a superior local education system was simply outsourcing their own talent pipeline development.
It all feeds back into the dynamo, every single piece.
All of this social engineering is, it's brilliant in its own way, but it all would have just collapsed if the core resource had failed.
And by the 1920s, the entire southern lumber industry was hitting an existential crisis.
They were victims of their own success, really. The traditional model, that bonanza philosophy,
mandated cutting all the merchantable timber, anything 14 inches in diameter and up. It was pure extraction.
And once the virgin timber was gone, they just liquidated the assets, tore up the rails, and moved west.
And this practice had left a devastated, cut-over landscape all across the South.
And the common wisdom at the time was deeply pessimistic. Reforestation was seen as economically unviable.
Right. They believed that second-growth pine was structurally inferior, that it warped, it shrank, and the growth rates were just too slow to justify the massive fixed infrastructure of a permanent town like Crossett.
But this is where Crossett took that critical divergent path.
Driven by the foresight of the Gates and Wysack families. And they were heavily influenced by these new progressive ideas that were coming out of the Yale School of Forestry.
They realized that their 500,000 acres were ultimately worthless if they didn't figure out a way to farm them sustainably.
So in 1927, they hired A.E. Wackerman, a Yale graduate, as their very first professional forester.
And that was the intellectual pivot point. It was the moment the company's identity shifted from a lumber extractor to a timber cultivator.
The ultimate testing ground for this new philosophy was established in 1934, the Crossett Experimental Forest, a 1,680-acre tract they donated to the U.S. Forest Service.
And this became the intellectual test tube for the entire southern pine industry.
The leader there was a man named R.R. Reynolds, who you could argue was the intellectual architect of the entire sustained yield revolution.
And his mission was radical for the time. He wanted to prove, with cold, hard, empirical data, that timber could be farmed just like any other row crop,
providing a perpetual yield that could sustain the mill infrastructure forever, in perpetuity.
And his demonstrations, which became known as the Farm Forestry 40s, they provided the undeniable proof. Let's start with the Poor 40.
The Poor 40 was a tract that is deliberately chosen because it was depleted. It was cut over land, exactly the kind of land that most companies had just abandoned as worthless.
And Reynolds managed this land intensely. The key innovation was this: cutting only the annual growth while leaving the capital, the standing timber, to regenerate and grow thicker.
The results were shocking to the industry. Over 15 years, this so-called worthless land produced annual returns that exceeded standard row crops like corn or cotton.
It wasn't just about rehabilitation. It was proving that scientifically managing degraded timberland was a profound economic engine.
And then the Good 40, which was managed for maximum potential yield, demonstrated what was possible under peak scientific management.
These experiments fundamentally shifted the entire economic calculus of forestry in the South.
They provided the data for the mantra that guided Crossett for decades. Good forestry is good business.
But actually implementing this kind of selective forestry across 500,000 dispersed acres, that faced a massive technological problem.
The logging railroad.
The railroad had been the lifeblood of the old system, but it was immensely expensive to build and maintain.
So once you laid those tracks, the financial pressure on you was immense. You had to make massive, heavy cuts. You had to clear cut every tree in sight, often trees smaller than 14 inches, just to make that track investment pay off.
Which made light, selective, sustainable cutting financially impossible.
So the company needed a technological breakthrough. And it arrived via the 1934 Pack Selective Logging Study, which was financed by the Charles Lothrop Pack Foundation.
This study researched the feasibility and the economics of replacing those old steam skidders and railroads with new gasoline-powered trucks.
And the finding was revolutionary. Trucks proved they could economically harvest very light volumes, as low as 750 board feet per acre, over widely dispersed areas.
Which meant you didn't have to clear cut anymore.
This was the true death knell for the logging railroad. It validated the technology that enabled the delicate surgical forestry that sustained yield required.
And a man named Levi Wilcoxon, the manager of the forestry division, was crucial in implementing this transition.
It allowed them to manage the entire 500,000 acres tract by tract, ensuring maximum yield without ever depleting the base resource. They had literally engineered sustainability into their company's DNA.
So sustained yield, that secures the raw material base forever. But that's only half the equation for survival.
The second half of Crossett's longevity, especially how they survived the Great Depression, was this philosophy of full utilization.
Wasting absolutely nothing.
In the traditional sawmill era, the waste was just staggering. Tops, limbs, low-grade hardwoods, all the sawdust.
It was all just burned or left to rot on the forest floor.
But Crossett looked at that waste and saw unexploited profit centers.
So in 1930, right in the middle of the Depression, they opened the Crossett Chemical Company.
And this facility was engineered to distill hardwood waste material that was previously considered absolute trash.
To produce valuable chemicals, methanol, acetic acid, wood tar.
It's a brilliant example of industrial symbiosis and the residual charcoal from that distillation process.
Pierced it into briquettes.
Branded it Royal Oak, which became a nationally recognized brand name that's still around today.
And here's where the utilization strategy directly serves the forestry strategy. It's so clever.
It is. The chemical plant provided a commercial market for all the low-value weed trees, specifically the scrub oaks that competed with the valuable pines for sunlight and nutrients.
So by making it profitable to harvest the scrub oak for charcoal,
they were simultaneously improving the health and the yield of their valuable pine stands. The chemical plant wasn't just a separate business. It was a tool for timber stand improvement, resource optimization.
And the absolute culmination of this full utilization strategy was the massive Crossett paper mill.
Built in 1937, and it was financed by the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC.
Getting that kind of federal financing during the depths of the Depression was a massive validation of the stability and the long-term vision of the Crossett model.
And the paper mill was designed for perfect integration. It wasn't meant to compete with the sawmill.
It consumed the pine thinnings that were generated by the new selective forestry program, and it used the sawlog tops.
All the material that was too small or too low quality for their high-end lumber products.
Yeah.
It maximized the economic return from every single tree they harvested.
And they didn't stop there. In 1955, they took another technological leap.
The food board mill. This was highly specialized. It used a blend of pine and hardwood pulp to create what they called bleached food board.
Primarily used for things like milk cartons and food packaging.
And this strategic move opened up a huge high-value market for the vast, previously uneconomical hardwood stands they had down in the river bottoms.
It ensured that virtually every part of every species of tree on their 500,000 acres was utilized for maximum profit.
It solidified their status as this unparalleled, integrated industrial powerhouse. They'd engineered an economy that truly lived up to that name you gave it. A dynamo.
Now we have to anchor this entire story in the historical reality of the American South.
We do.
This whole industrial success story, It all happened within a rigidly segregated society that was governed by Jim Crow laws.
Crossett was geographically and spatially divided. You had white Crossett on the west side of town and colored town situated on the east and south.
The sources are pretty clear that while the social hierarchy was absolute, African Americans were generally restricted to the manual labor roles in the mill and in the woods. The corporate structure imposed a really unique dynamic, a kind of infrastructure equality.
And that's a critical distinction to make. This wasn't like the typical southern shanty towns that sprang up near other mills.
The company's drive for efficiency and stability meant they provided the black quarter with housing of a similar structural quality to the white quarter. They maintained the streets, provided utility services like water and electricity.
They recognized that poor living conditions led to poor labor output, and that was true regardless of race.
They also invested strategically in black institutions. They supported the T.W. Daniels School, which was a model facility for black education. They donated land and funds for churches, like the Gates Chapel AME.
So it was this very complex and restrictive hierarchy coexisting with a complicated web of shared community pride. Residents, both black and white, benefited from the stability and the advanced infrastructure.
But the absolute social stratification of Jim Crow still determined where you worked and where you socialized.
Right. So fast forwarding to the post-World War II era, that paternalistic company town model starts to show some cracks. It's becoming a liability.
Maintenance costs were high, and the post-war population, they'd experienced wartime freedoms, economic opportunity elsewhere. There was a growing desire for independence and ownership.
The dependency model was becoming counterproductive to them.
So in 1946, the company makes this historic decision that became known as the Great Sell-Off.
They chose to divest. They offered to sell the company houses to the current occupants at bargain prices.
And the results were immediate. And they were a visible manifestation of that shift from tenant dependency to private ownership pride.
The uniformity of Crossett gray, that color that had symbolized the company's omnipresence for decades, it vanished almost overnight.
Replaced by a riot of varied colors, personalized room additions, unique landscaping, people were finally making the houses their own.
The psychological transformation was profound. The workers, who are now homeowners, they started investing their own capital and their own pride into their community.
And that invigorated the town. It led directly to its political maturation.
The town incorporated as a municipality. They elected a mayor and a council. They adopted the Bartholomew Plan for urban planning.
And independent civic groups, like the Lions Club in 1947, started springing up. Civic life was no longer strictly dictated by the company manager. It was owned by the residents.
But the true end of that independent, family-oriented control came in 1962.
The value of those 500,000+ acres and that highly diversified, self-sustaining industrial base, the sawmill, the chemical plant, the paper mills, it just made the Crossett Company an irresistible target.
A multi-billion-dollar target. Georgia Pacific Corporation purchased the Crossett Company.
And for the executives who had dedicated their whole lives to Cap Gates's unique industrial philosophy, the sale was traumatic.
It felt like a betrayal of their heritage, of the long-term vision they had worked so hard to maintain.
And GP's arrival brought swift, financially driven economic rationalization, and that resulted in immense cultural wounding for the community.
The GP mandate was clear. Eliminate non-core assets and maximize immediate shareholder value.
They systematically began erasing the physical monuments of the old corporate fiefdom. The old chemical plant was closed and dismantled.
And most symbolically, the iconic Rose Inn, that very structure that consumed 50 acres of lumber to project civility and permanence, the one you so keenly highlighted, it was demolished.
And the most evocative act for the people who lived there, that 275-foot smokestack was dynamited.
And the silencing of the mill whistle ended the 60-year auditory rhythm that had dictated, synchronized, and bound that town together. GP's changes were efficient, no doubt, but they systematically erased the tangible and the sonic monuments of the organization's unique identity.
So we followed this incredible story, from a wilderness that was declared a town by unilateral decree, through the logistical nightmare of Tent City.
And into a sustainable industrial empire that survived where all of its contemporaries failed.
And the legacy of Crossett's survival, it really boils down to two key organizational strategies.
First, the scientific foresight of sustained yield treating the forest as capital that has to regenerate.
And second, that relentless engineering drive for full utilization, turning every piece of waste into a profitable product, whether it was chemicals, charcoal, or high-value food board.
And for you as an IO psychologist, the takeaway here is it's profound. Crossett was a spectacularly successful industrial experiment, and it was built on a foundation of organizational control.
And those mechanisms of control, the mill whistle ensuring synchronization, the enforced morality of the dry town, the visual uniformity of Crossett Gray, they weren't accidental.
Not at all. They were a highly effective strategy to secure long-term stability, minimize turnover, and maximize profitability in a way that the purely extractive, laissez-faire models could never match.
Cap Gates treated his labor and his natural resources as integrated long-term investments. They had to be managed, controlled, and maintained for a perpetually stable organizational future.
And the physical monuments of that incredible commitment, the Rose Inn, the smokestack, the sound of the whistle, they're all gone now, nationalized out of existence.
But the true, enduring monument, it remains visible all across the landscape. Millions of acres of thriving, scientifically managed forest, a living testament to an industry that learned not just how to cut, but how to plant for the future.
Which raises a final, provocative thought for you to consider, especially in your field. In the modern, dispersed workplace of today, where loyalty is digital and efficiency is tracked by an algorithm, and stability is often invisible.
What are the modern equivalents of Crossett Gray or the mill whistle that companies use today? Where does that corporate identity physically or psychologically manifest itself to enforce loyalty, ensure efficiency, and secure their version of organizational control in a world without physical fiefdoms?
It's something certainly worth pondering as you navigate your next staffing challenge in this decentralized corporate environment.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.